This presentation is going to be the first in a series of presentations that will run from architectural prehistory all the way through modern time. Since this is your first presentation like this, please note you will need to take very good notes. Anything written in red is something that will be on a test. You will need to know the building name, location, date, and if we have it, if it's relevant, also the architect or who built it. Anything in green is something else that you're going to need to know, but it's going to be based on a vocabulary word or a concept. In order to have a discussion about architectural history, we first have to understand the basic timeline. The timeline that we use in the West was originally based on the life of Jesus Christ, and everything from the day Jesus Christ was born was called AD, Anno Domini, which meant during the life. We now call that Common Era. So when we live right now, when we say a year, we are talking about CE, Common Era. For instance, World War I started in this country on December 7th of 1941. That's 1,941 years AD or CE, Common Era. When we talk about ancient history, that is before Christ, which used to be BC. Now we say BCE, which is before Common Era. Those numbers count backwards. Something that was constructed in 1000 BCE would be older than something that was constructed in, say, 15 BCE. In order to understand architecture, we have to understand who we are. Buildings and architecture are simply an extension of the human condition. Whether we're talking about buildings that are 4,000 or 5,000 years old, or we're talking about modern buildings, they are simply an extension of our needs. So, in the beginning of human history, we only needed three things. We have to have food, we have to have water, and we have to have shelter. There's really nothing else in the equation that keeps us alive. Early humans' only interest was survival. Art, many of the other things that we think of as necessary today, would actually come later. They're byproducts of a time after we took care of the first three basic needs. Shelter is an interesting one. Shelter protects us from nature and, of course, from each other. Humans can die from cold, they can die from heat, rain, exposure to the sun over long periods of time will kill human beings. Wild animals, other humans and tribes, competition for food and resources are all dangerous. So shelter had to protect us from all of those things together. The primitive hut is the most basic piece of architecture that ever existed. No matter where you look on Earth, no matter how far back you go, all humans need shelter. It's one of the three primary ingredients for human survival. The primitive hut is an idea that the first humans would lean sticks against a wall or against a tree, maybe tie them together somehow, cover them in leaves or bark, and create some kind of shelter. This example of a primitive hut is extremely basic. We have what look like 6 to 8 inch trees that have been cut down, chopped into poles, and stuck in the ground. Across the top, we have the beginnings of some kind of roof, and it's all either notched or held together with animal hide. You can even see how they use what appears to be cowhide or buffalo hide to stretch along the sides to protect them from wind and rain. So human beings need more. We're not just basic animals like all the other creatures on Earth. We have emotional needs and ambitions. One of the things that happens in architectural history is a very, very, very long time ago, you see something that's added to primitive huts. Suddenly we start burying our dead. And this is actually an interesting practice. It's one thing to dig a hole in the ground and put somebody in the ground for sanitary purposes, but to build an entire building just to honor a dead person is completely unique to human beings. In this example, a megalithic tomb in Britain, which is about 5,000 years old, we see really, really large pieces of granite that have been stacked together. We know this is a tomb, and it raises a couple of questions. The first is, why on earth would you even go to this much effort? We think somebody very important was buried here, maybe a king, maybe a tribal leader, but we of course don't know anymore. The other question is, how did they get this stone in place? Which is something we still don't know. The main idea here is that they made the effort to build something. This wasn't a home, this was simply a grave. And this is a turning point in architectural history. So there are a lot of time periods that overlap in this slideshow, but one of the words that we have to understand is megalithic. Megalithic means mega is giant, and lithic typically means archaeological find or stone, something that was used in this time period. Um, Megalithic overlaps a very long period of time, all the way up through Egypt, even ancient Greece. But for our purposes, we're looking at the Stone Age. You might think of this as the caveman era. And for architectural purposes, everything that you're going to see here is megalithic. Basic structures that we're going to see in this megalithic time period are post and lintel and corbelling. Architecture essentially is a structure that has to span some level of space. We want to be able to get under it for shelter. In the case of a tomb, we want to protect the body. Post and lintel is the most basic. Most people think that post and lintel started because a tree, which is vertical, you could take a stick and put it across the top of two trees and tie it in place. The stick that goes across the top would be called the lintel. We might also use the word beam. You can even see in this image the post or the columns that are vertical, and the lintel is the three stones that go across the top. Corbelling is a type of stacking stones where as they go up on the wall, you move them slightly closer together, so you get an almost upside down V shape, which creates the roof. A corbel or corbelling is when you stack stones, like seen in this example, and they get slightly closer and closer together as they go up, and you create a vault or a long, tall, triangular structure that creates the roof. Here's an interesting example of two different stone walls that actually have a lintel, which is that flat beam that crosses, and then in order to keep the weight off of that beam so it wouldn't break, they actually used corbelling above that lintel. So this is a combination of a lintel with corbels. Most of you will recognize this. This is Stonehenge. It was built sometime around 3000 to 2000 BCE in the Salisbury Plain of England. Some of the most interesting things about Stonehenge is we know very little about the people who built it. We know that the stones weigh thousands and thousands of pounds and were brought 200 miles from the mountains where they were cut out of the side of. The fact that the stones that created this monument were dragged for over 200 miles in a time period when there were no wheels or carts shows the incredible importance this monument had on the people who built it. We know that it aligns with stars and has astronomical significance. To this day, we don't know whether that was a religious rite that was performed here or something else. One of the most incredible parts about Stonehenge is even though these rocks look bumpy and not on purpose, they're actually very carefully carved. You'll notice even in this image, you can see where one of them tapers. It's fatter at the bottom and skinnier at the top. Each of the lintels, which is the horizontal stones resting on top, has a notch in it so that it won't fall off. They're also very accurately curved, and to this day, nobody has any idea how they lifted those stones into place. The dolmen are a series of structures, literally hundreds of structures, across Ireland that in some ways are similar to what we see at Stonehenge, but more primitive. These are rocks that are found. They are not carved like the ones at Stonehenge, but they are stacked probably as markers to territory for tribesmen. This was built around 3800 BC, though their purpose, who built them, and exact dates is still unknown.